Joining me now from the NASDAQ in Times Square is Chris Hughes, co-founder of Facebook and author of Fair Shot, Rethinking Inequality and How We Earn. Chris, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So in the book, you're very open about your story with Facebook. You've made hundreds of millions of dollars from the Facebook IPO. You were roommates with Mark Zuckerberg. What do you make of Facebook now, worth over $500 billion?
Man, it's huge and keeps growing bigger. Facebook, I think, is at a really pivotal moment, though. I think we've known it's a massive social network where we go to share photos of our weddings and kids, etc. But now I think the world is, and Facebook itself is, increasingly aware that it's a powerful institution in our politics, in our culture, and there's a responsibility that comes with that. So from a dollars and cents perspective, the Facebook, the company just keeps growing, but from a cultural and political one, I think there's a responsibility that Mark is owning and working on. I'm glad to see it.
Yeah, well, speaking of the political responsibility, do you think Facebook should be regulated? I mean, it's a pretty hot topic on Capitol Hill these days.
I don't know about regulated, but I think that the first step is understanding that Facebook is the platform for social connections on the web. Over 80% of the social traffic on the web goes through Facebook's servers, particularly if you're including WhatsApp and Instagram. And I think with that comes an immense responsibility, not just for security and privacy, which are things that we've talked about for some time, but also for making sure that people feel like they can trust the network to understand perspectives that are perhaps different than theirs, certainly not to be hacked or something in the case of elections. And that responsibility is real, it's growing, and I think they recognize it, but we're all waiting to see what they do over the next few months and years.
You worked on former President Obama's 2008 campaign. So
Back in the day.
Facebook was a big role there.
Yeah.
So what do you make of the whole fake news situation? Obviously, the fake news headwinds were not really existent in 2008, but obviously in 2016, they played a much bigger role.
They played a huge role. I think it's a complex issue because what one person considers news, another person might not. And the president runs around all the time using the phrase fake news about things that are actually very true and very real. So as much as the term is bandied about, what is not confusing is that there is a responsibility, I think, on Facebook's part and Twitter and many of the other social networks to ensure that people are not just hearing news that they like, news that they find pleasant, but news that they might not like and that they might not find as pleasant, and that is more provocative. And when it comes to the algorithms in particular that are part of Facebook, I think it's important to bear in mind that people design those. They're not handed down on stone tablets from above, and with that comes a responsibility. And I think what's key is that the Facebook understands that when it comes to the network, but hopefully more and more people who benefit from Facebook, who make a lot of money from Facebook, also understand that there's a responsibility on economic issues too, which are particularly important to me today.
And people may not realize Facebook, now 14 years old.
Yeah.
What was Mark Zuckerberg like in the early days?
We were all college kids. We were roommates, and Mark was the coder of the group. He was interested in all kinds of different topics, but he came in with those skills. Dustin was not a coder at first, but learned very fast how to do so. And I was the one who was always the non-coder, who did marketing and communications, product development, those kinds of things. But it was we were an eclectic combination that you can only find in a place like Harvard, where people come from all different kinds of backgrounds, and yet still are interested in things like how can you create a little social network that people might enjoy and want to use.
And there's been some off and on speculation that Mark Zuckerberg may run for president at some point. What do you think of that?
I think he said pretty clearly he doesn't want to, and it's been a pretty firm answer, and hopefully the world can move on to more important topics.
Do you think Facebook will be around in 20 years?
I think so. I have no reason not to know. To the extent that anybody has a crystal ball about the internet in 20 years, I think Facebook has got as good a chances just about any other technology to be around. It'll take good guidance, good leadership, et cetera, to make that possible. It's not a fait accompli, but I don't see why not.
Let's also talk about Fair Shot. This is your new book. Your plan is to have the wealthy finance a $500 a month payment to those making under $50,000 a year. Go into the details of sort of how you came up with this.
So I make the case in the book that the record stock market highs and record lows for unemployment do not tell the full story of what's happening in the American economy. In reality, jobs are coming apart. We're creating jobs and there is work, but they're part-time, they're contingent, and they're relatively unreliable. And we have to think about all the changes that technology is likely to bring over the next decades, and the best way to prepare for that and address the problems of today is a guaranteed income of $500 for working people who make less than 50K. So my view isn't that we need to pass out money so people can hang out, put up their feet, and play video games. Instead, it's that when you talk to working people about what they need most, it's financial stability. And the most powerful way to provide that is through money, is through cash.
And in the book, you talk about how this is different from universal basic income. Explain the difference.
They're inspired by the same ideals that people deserve basic dignity, that people should have the freedom to pursue their dreams. UBI is often talked about in the context of robots and self-driving cars as a solution to a problem in 2050. And that many of those problems may arrive, but I'm really focused on the here and now. And what can we do tomorrow to make sure that we stabilize the lives of middle-class Americans? The median wages have not budged meaningfully in 40 years, and the 0.1% richest people own as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. So I think the conversation about technology in 20 or 30 years is interesting, but I'm very focused on the historic income inequality that we have today and what we can do to combat it.
Could this income inequality sort of snowball beyond just inequality and actually pose a serious risk for the entire economy?
I think so. And particularly when we look at the Trump tax bill and some of the changes that it makes, it seems to double down on what I think history has debunked, the theory of trickle-down economics, that if you just lower rates on corporations, it'll be good for working people. And we've got 40 years, decades of economic history now to prove that that is exactly the opposite of what's true. I do think there's hope, though, because it's not like the economy just exists and it works in the background and we just have to respond to it. We can design and modify the rules of the road to make sure that the economy is much more fair. And a guaranteed income isn't a silver bullet, but I do think that it is the most powerful thing that we can do to spur innovation and to encourage entrepreneurship and help people make ends meet.
Yeah, what kind of economic growth could a plan like this unleash, in your view?
I think it's significant. The Roosevelt Institute, which is a pretty widely respected think tank, did a big study in conjunction with several academics last year, and they found that if you provided a guaranteed income of $500 a month, paid for by progressive taxation, it could boost GDP over the next 8 years by 7 points. 7 points over 8 years. And the reason is pretty simple. It's because if you put $100 in the pockets of a working person, they're likely to spend it on housing, healthcare, childcare, education, gas to go interview for a job. Whereas if you put that same $100 in the bank, if you give it to a wealthy person, they'll put it in the bank account, and it won't be at work in the productive economy. And given that our economy is driven by consumer spending, the more money that's in the pockets of people who can invest it in themselves and one another, the more likely it is to spur economic growth. So it's the reason that I think that ultimately this isn't about pitchforks coming for the rich, but instead it's about what's going to make it our commonwealth be much more robustly and fairly shared.
But to be clear, this is a political proposal, right, versus something that maybe the private sector can help with?
Well, there's a big role for the private sector in the short term. I think the organization I co-run called the Economic Security Project, we've supported a demonstration of the idea in Stockton, California, a city that went bankrupt a few years ago but now has a very entrepreneurial and widely respected mayor. And we're going to demonstrate the power of a guaranteed income in the lives of many of the residents of Stockton. So the private sector and philanthropy in particular can play a role in the short term in illustrating how this might work and in exploring some of those questions. In the long term, I do think we need public policy at a state or a federal level to really address the depth of the problem that we have, which is historic in its size.
So what is the appetite then among politicians for a plan like this? Have you been in touch with Capitol Hill or with local politicians?
It's real, and it's growing. I mean, in the House, Congressman Ro Khanna has introduced a bill. In the Senate, Senator Sherrod Brown have been introduced a bill to expand the earned income tax credit and modernize it. So in my view, those are very good proposals. However, I think they should go even further in order to create some momentum here. And the reason is because if we created a guaranteed income through the earned income tax credit, which has a wonky name, but it is the most popular anti-poverty program we have on the right and the left. Every president since Gerald Ford, Republican and Democrat alike, has expanded the program because it works. We've got a lot of social science to show it. And as a result, I think there's an opportunity for some kind of bipartisan consensus. I don't think it's going to be this year. I don't think it's going to be next. But as the conversation around repealing and replacing Trump's tax plan begins to gain steam, I do hope that this will be at the center of it.
So what role will you have in these discussions? You've sort of ignited this conversation around this book. What's next for you in this sort of fight to get this plan enacted politically?
Well, I think in the short term, the challenge is starting the conversation in a way that people take some time to think about the issues. A lot of people think about income inequality, but we often talk about education or reducing regulations on small businesses as the ways to combat it. I think sometimes we overlook the simplest solution, and sometimes the simplest solution can be the best. So my goal is to convene a conversation, provoke a conversation around cash, demonstrate it in places like Stockton and elsewhere across the country, and build the momentum in states, other cities, and the long term at a federal level to rethink how we combat income inequality and put a guaranteed income at the center of that conversation.
And you mentioned the private sector earlier. It seems like some big tech companies are already trying to start to help problems that the government hasn't been able to solve. Most recently, JP Morgan Chase, Amazon, and Berkshire Hathaway coming together to tackle healthcare costs. Is that something that the private sector can come together and do in the mold of a universal basic income?
I think you could imagine it. I think it, a lot remains to be seen, certainly, on the healthcare initiative that you mentioned. On guaranteed income, I think it's possible to have a broader conversation. I think there is a role that companies can play, but I think most of the time it comes down really to the leaders at those companies, who are specific individuals who almost always have massively benefited from the economy that we live in, which rewards a very small number of people while leaving 90%, 99% behind. So I do think that the more of those leaders we can have in the conversation, thinking about how they as individuals and their companies can make a difference, the more robust and the stronger it'll be.
All right, certainly a story we'll continue to follow. The book, again, is Fair Shot. Chris Hughes, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.